Welcome to the 336th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I talk with anthropologist Peter Redfield, author of Life in Crisis: The Ethical Journey of Doctors Without Borders. As a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. Just a program note here, I want to acknowledge Kristen Urquiza and her work yesterday as guest host yesterday on COVID calls, talking about the COVID situation in schools in Arizona. Just a fantastic discussion that Kristen led, and I'm happy to say she's going to be back every Tuesday in September. So if you didn't catch Kristen Urquiza yesterday on COVID calls, please do make time next Tuesday to catch her discussion about COVID in schools in Texas. We'll be talking about activism there to try to make schools safe for kids and teachers. So please join us for that. As of today, September 8th, 2021, there are 4,585,792 deaths globally from COVID-19. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is Kurdish Swedish humanitarian Nimam Gafuri dies from COVID-19 in Stockholm. This was written by Layla Maghribi and appeared in the National April 6th, 2021. An activist who founded an NGO to help Kurdish and Yazidi victims recover from the horrors of ISIS control died from COVID-19 in Stockholm. Humanitarian Dr. Nimam Gafuri, 52, was described on Facebook by her brother Karwan Gafuri as beautiful, brave, determined, and joyful. Came into this world amidst war, born in a cave, lived your life to the fullest like a hurricane of hope, and you left this world with strength, he wrote. Lokman Atroshi, Director General of the Swedish Specialist Hospital, also used social media to express his grief at the loss of his dear friend. She sacrificed her life, career, and health for justice and to help vulnerable people of Kurdistan, Dr. Atroshi wrote on Facebook. At the time that this article was written in April of 2021, Sweden was in the midst of a third wave of COVID-19 infections. The other day, I went to the cave I was born in. Every time it feels like being reborn again, Dr. Gafuri wrote in one of her last posts on Facebook in March of 2021. In a 2016 interview with Harper's Bazaar magazine, the cardiothoracic surgeon spoke about being born in the cave her family was sheltering in to avoid Iraqi air forces. Her Kurdish father, a Peshmerga who was fighting Saddam Hussein's army, eventually took the family to Iran and then to Sweden, where Dr. Gafuri studied, trained, and practiced medicine for decades. After the emergence of ISIS in Iraq, the atrocities and humanitarian disasters that followed, the doctor left Sweden and traveled to the region to offer her medical expertise on the front line. I was born in the mountains during the war, so I know what it's like to be a refugee. That is why I know how to help refugees now, she told the Danish Kurdish newspaper Jian in 2015. In 2014, she set up the organization Joint Help for Kurdistan, JHK, in response to the Sinjar massacre in the same year, which marked the beginning of the genocide of Yazidis by ISIS. During ISIS's reign of terror, thousands of women and children were enslaved and raped, and hundreds of thousands from the community became displaced. One of the last posts on her Facebook page, the doctor noted how little had changed in the place she was born. The sounds of water, the smell of grass, she wrote, playful kids, all could suddenly mix with smells and sounds of napalm and the deadly silence afterwards. She ended her post with the ominous warning, We have come long, yet not far enough from the same danger. Okay, I'd like to turn to the conversation for today, and this is one I've really been looking forward to. Let me introduce my guest, Peter Redfield. Peter Redfield is professor of anthropology and Urburu Chair in Ethics, Globalization and Development at the University of Southern California. Trained as a cultural anthropologist, sympathetic to history, he concentrates on circulations of science, technology, and medicine in colonial and post-colonial contexts. He's the author of Life in Crisis, The Ethical Journey of Doctors Without Borders, which appeared in 2013 with California Press, and Space in the Tropics, From Convicts to Rockets in French Guiana, which appeared in 2000. He's also co-editor of Forces of Compassion, Humanitarianism Between Ethics and Politics, which appeared in 2011, and an issue of the journal Limb, which appeared in 2018 on the theme of little development devices and humanitarian goods. He's held fellowships at the School for Advanced Study in Santa Fe and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, in addition to serving as president of the Society for Cultural Anthropology. Peter Redfield, great to bring you to COVID Calls.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's wonderful to be here.
Let me start the way I generally do, find out where you're calling from and what the COVID situation is looking like there.
Sure. At the moment, I'm talking to you from Los Angeles, or more precisely from Santa Monica, California. I've just been here a few weeks. I spent most of the pandemic in North Carolina and Chapel Hill, where most of my life has been until recently. But having taken a new job at the University of Southern California, I was first working remotely and now am in LA. LA has, it's had some ups and downs during the longer COVID story, as pretty much almost any part of the world could say at this point, that things have gotten better or gotten worse, and everyone has had an opportunity to fail, I would say, in one fashion or another over this extended experience. There has been an uptick in the past month, in August, of cases and hospitalizations, but it looks like it's on a downward slope currently. So I would say, in terms of the widely varied map of the United States, at the moment, California is not terrible. The vaccination rates are fairly high, especially in LA County, and especially it's obviously demarcated by class and access in a variety of different ways, and what would be shorthanded as compliance in terms of uptake. But let me just end by saying there are worse places in the United States right now, far worse places. My understanding is a lot of the ICU beds are full in Southern California, but it's not like they're not overloaded the way that it is elsewhere. But that's what I've currently heard.
And you arrived, or you were there, but now there's the recall election is going, which is a little hard to understand and follow from the outside. I have to say, I sat down the other night with my kids and tried to, I'm telling this story, it's occupational hazard of being a child of a historian, but I sat down with my kids to try to explain how a recall election in California works. And I literally had to stop because it was so complicated. But COVID's running through that discussion as well, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. COVID is running through everything these days, one way or another. And in many ways, politics are running through COVID, of course, in many ways, in many different parts of the world. I know what you're saying about the occupational hazard, having a daughter who was oppressed by having a couple of academic parents. And when she went off to college, she told me once in a very memorable line, the last thing she wants is to have lunch with a professor. She's had lunch with professors her entire life. So she's looking forward to having lunch with other people for a while. But leaving that aside, yes, the recall election is hard to grasp, even when you're sitting in California, and I think it's one of these examples of good ideas with unintended consequences, in that the whole referendum system in California is one where it's meant to allow for a greater degree of direct democracy, but of course that can cut both ways. And even my educational career for the period of my life where I was in California, which is I'm not really from anywhere in an absolute sense, but as much as I am from somewhere, I went to middle and high school in Northern California. And infamously, Proposition 13 on property taxes altered the state of state finances, and therefore the trajectory of educational institutions, both primary and secondary, and of higher education in the state. So, and the recall fits with that too. And when people are upset with something and tired of something, it's no surprise that children, when they're small and they need to go to bed, they get annoyed with everyone around them typically. Right. And I think that's the state of many voters in many places, including here. Although the polls currently make it look like it's fortunately not going to go through, because it ends up being very anti-democratic in the sense that someone could win with a very small percentage of the vote if the vote were to replace the current sitting governor.
I've been asking guests if they wouldn't mind sharing a memory of this time, which is sort of the impossible assignment of pulling one thing out. There must be many, but I wonder if there's something particularly resonant for you that is like something that is peculiar to this era for you.
There's one thing which it occurs to me to mention. I mean, there are many memories, of course, and there are different periods. By now, this has gone on long enough that as a historian, you'd start to create periods, and you could say, I'm a historian of the late middle pandemic. These kinds of things.
Sure.
But in the early pandemic, the very, very early pandemic, the first onset in March, or that is the first moment where we became aware it was a thing. I was actually in California then as well in March of 2020, right before I was visiting USC, and it was right before USC closed down. And I remember meeting somebody who was also visiting, who was giving a job talk, an interview, and holding out my hand to shake her hand the way that I'm habituated to do. It's the polite kind of gesture. And if you've grown up in a context like North America, it's something that your body does initially when you first meet someone. And she recoiled, she pulled back. And then in subsequent conversation, I found out that she had health issues. So she was following this very, very closely. But it was the moment where, for me, viscerally, personally, I suddenly realized, oh, this is really going to be something here. Because I'd read a lot about pandemics, I'd experienced lots of health situations elsewhere in the world, but this was a moment where all this was arriving home. And not just arriving home, but it was arriving into the middle of my habits and my even the half-conscious bodily habits that you have of interacting with other people. And of course, by now when I see someone else coming down the street, I give them room, and I act in a very different way. So I'm now habituated differently than I was then, as I think many of us are. But that was a moment that I became aware suddenly that this was going to be real, and it was also going to change.
It's so interesting and provokes for me a kind of a similar memory from around that time when you may recall we were actually trying to figure out how to adapt that, and because the handshake, and in certain parts of the United States, the handshake is like really essential. And in certain kinds of things, so I was living in New Jersey at that time, and we have a man who often would come and work on our house, really became a great treasured family friend. Great handshake, just a great handshake guy. And I could tell it was bothering him, and so he was experimenting. And at that point he was working on the thing where you touch feet. I don't know if you ever did that. Like, it's not that easy to do if you're not athletic, but something a soccer player might do. So you stick out your foot, the other person sticks out their foot, and you kind of tap. But you still got to be pretty close to do it, but I could see he was, and then subsequently after that, we went to a fist bump, and then eventually no contact. And so your memory really sticks with me. The other thing it makes me think of is that, like so many things in this pandemic and the various eras, is people who are immunocompromised, have disabilities, or are more attentive to health because of chronic health conditions, who have been telling us time and time again what was coming. And I don't want to read too much into that one interaction, but that really strikes me from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's true that as well, we live at this moment where people are, and the pandemic has been a catalyst for this, where people are becoming aware of lots of norms and lots of habits and entrenched ways of doing things. Some of which are, most of them are, in a sense, culturally arbitrary, and they've changed through time, and they change by context. But there are patterns of expectation that you interact with other people in a particular way that does not display vulnerability, a concern for vulnerability for health. That the normative way of interacting with other people, the expectation that's dominant in many social settings, is that you just expect to spend time with groups in close association, which of course is also, in the world of infectious disease, when you're most exposed to any kind of pathogen. It's what cities have always done, and armies, and any kind of refugee camps, migrations, any kind of association of large numbers of people, especially people who are not used to spending lots of time together, or strangers coming together. It's often where you have outbreaks. And for people who have become aware, have been forced to become aware of their own vulnerability through their medical condition, it does provide them with a kind of sensitive antenna to that potential that I think was lacking for many of us, even those of us who might intellectually know things. Although, of course, there are counter arguments too. There's the hygiene hypothesis. There are debates about, you can also be too sanitized. You can be too clean, as well as being too risky. I mean, life is always this complicated dance and balance, concerns of health. But those of us who have not had to live with that as directly until the pandemic, I think were short-sighted and not aware of the risks that we might be posing to others as well as to ourselves.
Yeah, it might be a theme we come back to, because even just your discussion, I guess I hadn't thought of it quite this way, but again, trying to understand those who are acting out against masks, or who are, vaccine. There's vaccine hesitancy, and then there's anti-vaccination politics. But somewhere in there's a signaling of one's own health. There's a sort of a testimony that people are giving, I think, to say, I'm healthy. I've heard this a lot, even from people in my family. I'm healthy, so I don't need to do this. A statement of health as a testifying to their own health as a condition. That's who I am. I'm healthy. And I think that's powerful. And I think a lot of people, even when they're not healthy, they can conceptualize themselves that way. And so their antennae are tuned to something else, as you might say.
I think you're absolutely right. There is health is a form of identity, in the sense that, and it's one that people can be very strongly attached to, a sense of their own relation to the world and their relative vulnerability. And people have different expectations of that. And notoriously young men, I would say, especially men in general, but especially young men, have a tendency to want to project a state of being invulnerable and immortal in a sense. And of course, everybody who is very young, in a brief period of time, who hasn't had a brush with real illness or a kind of sobering accident or a disaster or something that really disrupted their lives, I think there is this period where you can feel immortal when you're young. I mean, I once a friend of my parents who was older than my parents, had been in World War II, had been in the South Pacific in World War II, and had once been in a ship that had gone down. He was British and gone down and had survived a very arduous period of his life and told stories about this kind of thing. But I remember having a conversation with him when I was 19, and he looked at me and he said, "I bet you think you're immortal." And I thought, because he had been 19 when this happened to him, and I thought, right, he's right. I hadn't thought of it that way. I hadn't conceived of it that way, but that was my assumption in the world. And he was gently letting me know that, well, you'll feel that way for a while until you don't. Mm-hmm. And I think that's maybe part of what's at stake with questions of the vaccine, questions of behavior. And then the other thing, which I do think is important to say, is the response to COVID has been extraordinary. It's not just COVID or just an outbreak or the spread of a pathogen, a pandemic, which, there are many examples. Part of what's extraordinary is the wide range of policy that's been enacted in response globally at scale. And that is striking and unusual. And some of it, has undoubtedly saved lives. Some of it may not have saved lives. Some of it may have caused other suffering. It's complicated, and policy people who are making policy, especially on the fly, don't always get it right. And people who build models are building models, and models are not reality, as we always have to constantly remind ourselves and be reminded. And some of the early commentary about this pandemic among the people I'm familiar with, people who've, especially in anthropology, who've looked at pandemics, there's been a whole group of people that were focused very much on potential flu variant outbreaks before H1N1 and the possibility of a deadly pandemic flu along the lines of the 1918-19 outbreak. There was a whole set of discussion academically about this possibility, and they were all floored by the response to this coronavirus. Not just the fact of this coronavirus, or that that it was spreading, or all the rest of it, but also the response and the speed at which you had different kinds of policies, including policies of lockdown, which are, at the end of the day, they are also, like lots of public health, it's militaristic, and it's being done for the greater good. But these are there are a lot of fairly crude instruments that are being used to try and control population health. And for people, I imagine maybe some of your relatives in Texas, they don't take too kindly to that kind of thing. And in many parts of the world, people don't. And it posed real problems for people, say, who are day laborers in settings like India or many economies where people are making their living daily. If suddenly you shut things down, that creates a whole other crisis. And so nothing is simple in the world of public health, especially in emergency and moments of extreme outbreak.
Just want to remind everyone you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Peter Redfield today, and we're going to turn to talking about humanitarian aid. I think we were just getting into that kind of discussion, and I want to ask you, you've written lots of books, but I want to ask you about Life in Crisis, the ethical journey of Doctors Without Borders. There's so many notes in there that I've been thinking back to as I've been trying to understand the pandemic, not just pandemic in places that we think Doctors Without Borders usually would be, like Africa or South Asia, but also what it means in North America as well, to think about humanitarian aid in the midst of a pandemic. And I guess my first question is kind of an open one, which is, How do you see that work now? I mean, looking back at it through the glass of COVID, how does Doctors Without Borders look to you, and the kinds of questions you were asking about humanitarian aid 10 years ago? How do those questions look to you now?
Sure. I mean, I would say a couple of things. One, I'm very glad I did that project. It helped me understand a lot of things about the world better than I would have otherwise, because I had to learn a lot of background information that I simply didn't know. There's much more work on humanitarianism now and writing about humanitarianism, but when I started, especially at the beginning of this century, the early 2000s, there was far less, and I had to figure many things out. The great thing about MSF, Doctors Without Borders, is that they deal with a wide variety of health problems. I mean, that was hard as a researcher because I had to learn about a lot of different things, and they're not all the same. I mean, you can die from lots of things, you can get sick from lots of things, and the treatment is not identical, even in a domain like what anthropologists call biomedicine, modern scientific medicine. It has a range of therapeutics for different kinds of conditions with different expectations, and it's better with some things and worse with other things. As everyone who's visited any hospital or clinic or doctor's office knows. The plus side of that as a researcher is it was a lot of work, but I learned about a range of things. Looking back on it 10 years later, I mean, had I known there was going to be a big Ebola outbreak in West Africa, I would have written more about their legacy in Ebola. It's a very small piece of the book because it's not a common disease, or was not common prior to that outbreak in West Africa. It was thought of as being relatively exotic. But then, of course, it was in many ways a kind of forerunner for the coronavirus in terms of an awareness of potential vulnerability in the United States. And people had been modeling Ebola for some time. It's in all the writing about outbreak diseases and new infectious diseases. It had had a place of honor because it's a highly dangerous pathogen to come down with. And so I would have spent more time thinking about Ebola, which is fascinating. And that was a fascinating story also for MSF, because it's a moment where they really were on the front lines, literally. And it's very strange to have a voluntary organization, an NGO, a non-governmental organization, playing a central role in global health. But in that instance, they were. With this current pandemic, it's affected them. It's affected all of their projects. It's affected every situation around the world. It's difficult to simultaneously be dealing with a pandemic which is truly spread widely, which has multiple variants, and could appear at any notice, when you're also dealing with other disasters, you're dealing with other illnesses. And of course, one of the real problems of the pandemic from a healthcare perspective is not just COVID itself as a disease condition, but it's also the fact that if you have a lot of COVID patients, that puts pressure on the whole healthcare system. And it means people who have other problems may not get appropriate attention or care. There may not be the ICU bed available for them. And those kinds of shortages, that possibility of shortage and triage, medical selection, that is conscious medical selection. There's always medical selection, but self-conscious decision-making on the part of healthcare providers of who will receive treatment and how and when. All of that was very foreign, say, in a context like North America. People were not used to thinking about that. But in the world of Doctors Without Borders, that's been present all the time. And I spent a lot of time thinking about triage and thinking about the kinds of difficult decisions that healthcare providers can be called upon to make in situations where you have scarcity. And people who live in affluent societies are not used to confronting scarcity. It makes us deeply uncomfortable. And yet it's a reality, of course, for many, many others living on the planet.
So just for people who are just tuning in, so we're talking about Doctors Without Borders from your 2013 book, like Life in Crisis, and you referred to MSF. So I mean, it's a French organization, and I'm gonna irritate my wife because I'm about to garble the French, but Médecins Sans Frontières. How do you? What's the right way to say it?
Médecins Sans Frontières is the Doctors Without Borders, is literally the translation. They're known in the aid world through their French acronym, which is also an acronym in a number of other languages. It works across several languages. So even Doctors Without Borders is MSF USA, the US branch of them.
I see.
We can call them Doctors Without Borders for the purposes of our show. They go by many names in many places. It's a complicated.
They even stealthily sneak the French acronym into English. There's some members of Congress, once they find that out, they're gonna root that out.
Oh, absolutely, yes. No, it would be you'll have to make it Freedom USA or something like that. You know. Doctors for free doctors.
Yeah, free doctors for
doctors free of borders. There we go.
There, that's it exactly. One of the things in the book that I learned a lot about also was the way that Doctors Without Borders had to struggle with the sort of boundaries of what medicine is. And when they find themselves in places, once again, we used to sort of think of this as some distant problem, but they're offering medical care in places that don't have consistent and high levels of, certainly for disasters, high levels of medical care, but also places in which wars are ongoing and in which these doctors may themselves become witness to genocide, war crime, or the everyday violence of ongoing war. And it's provoked this kind of crisis, if I understand it right, a kind of crisis within the crisis where the doctors have to decide, like, is violence a pathology? Is violence itself? Do we have a duty to intervene or to witness or to go on the witness stand? I never really thought of it quite that way historically until I read your work. And I want to ask you about that because I also think it has implications for what we've been seeing in the pandemic, where essential workers have been pushed into the role as moral and ethical actors to take a stand on things that go beyond just intubating a patient.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it's a confounding problem, one which doesn't have a simple solution. And that's part of what I found interesting about the organization is they work out their response through practice, through time, and in different situations, they've tried different things. And in some settings, they present themselves very much as being outspoken with certain issues. In other settings, they are less likely to do that if they feel that it's not strategic to do so. Because being too outspoken can also mean that you could be shut down or you could be removed, or you could, in the context, say, of the pandemic, if you get into too much of an argument with your relative about vaccination or masking or whatever it might be, it can also damage the relationship in a way that will not achieve the desired effect. If the goal is to get the person to get a vaccine or to mask and not, or to do something that would reduce harm to that person or to others, it can it can become even larger as a problem than it initially was. So speaking out is easy to say and easy to conceive, but how you speak out and to whom and to what degree, obviously there are moments, and genocide for MSF, the genocide in Rwanda especially was, for Doctors Without Borders, was a particularly one of several particularly traumatizing, difficult episodes where you've reached a limit of what you can do as a doctor and what medicine can do. And if people are actively intent on slaughtering others, there is no space for you. I mean, you can try and help, but you can't cure genocide medically. It's not a medical problem. Ultimately, it's a political problem. And most of the problems that Doctors Without Borders and similar organizations in the medical humanitarian world deal with are ultimately political problems. They're problems of trust and relationship, and problems of care, of whether or not those who are in a position of some degree of power and authority care about the lives and well-being of their citizenry or their neighbors and so on. And that's not ultimately a medical issue. And their story shows that again and again, even if it does have medical effects. And so they're constantly responding to problems which have their root causes elsewhere, which they cannot directly, there is no pill or injection or a splint that you could, or whatever one could imagine that you can apply to what is ultimately a political issue.
Thinking about that back in the United States, I mean, early on in COVIDCalls, I had a conversation with a physician in San Francisco named Peter Chin Hong, who's a brilliant doctor and teacher, and we talked just before George Floyd was murdered, and then we also talked after, and he said something that kind of brought me up short, which is he said, well, everybody in my world knows that racism is a public health concern. So he kind of converged those two worlds in which I had still been sort of thinking of medicine as, not that there weren't activist doctors, but that racism itself was not something you could conceptualize medically. But he said, no, he encouraged his medical students to, if they wanted to, that they should be on the streets protesting as well. And they could protest out of conscience, but they could also protest because that should be their job, which is to try to save lives. And it opened up this thing, that broader concern that that there's vast inequalities in healthcare in America, and they have to do with structural racism. And it is the role of a doctor or a public health worker, or maybe a nurse, to get out there and do something about that. It was a really provocative conversation for me, and it was that was not yet in wide circulation at that point. And then there was the backlash, which from predictable places, but also from some unpredictable places for me too, as well. People who said, no, people in medicine need to do medicine. And the minute they open their mouth and start talking about the politics of the world, they discredit themselves. And I imagine you were tracking that discussion as well.
Absolutely. And it's an ongoing, continuing discussion, especially many, not all, but many of the people I met who work with Doctors Without Borders and similar organizations are deeply upset about the state of the world. And it's obvious to anyone in public health that inequality appears in the clinic all the time, in the sense you're treating problems. And this is an old observation from the longer history of public health, of social medicine, of a variety of different strands and different perspectives, but that is entirely predictable. And there are many, many studies which have shown this repeatedly. If there's one summary of all findings in public health to present, it would be that if you're poorer and you're more oppressed in one way or another, you're most likely statistically to have wealth in different parts of the world. And racism or other forms of discrimination, other whatever language one might use in different settings, different contexts, people who are at the receiving end of any kind of hierarchical system where they are lower down rather than being higher up, they tend to suffer. And so people who are in healthcare who have spent some time engaging with problems, especially simple, solvable problems, diseases that are not rare, specialized diseases or new outbreak diseases, or something where you need really expensive equipment to treat, but very, very basic stuff. And there are people dying all around this world of very basic problems that are not a mystery. It's not, it doesn't require specialized, complicated research to treat them. It requires political and economic will, and absent that, it's difficult to resolve medically, while at the same time, medically, everybody who's a healthcare professional has to deal with these problems. It's the same thing with gunshot wounds, say, in the United States. I mean, it's obvious that if you have lots of gunshot wounds, you have to, it's of a concern for you if you're working in a context where that's a problem. And maybe the last thing which I would just throw in, which I learned from following humanitarianism, is especially if people are working in open conflict settings, because it's one thing to demonstrate, but demonstration assumes a particular kind of context where you can. If you're in an active war zone where politics has spilled over directly into, or spilled over into direct violence and direct opposition, it can be very important to say things, but it's also incumbent to think strategically about your politics. And there are moments, and this is a difficult thing to say in relation to politics, because I also became interested in the history of neutrality, which is complicated and tied with the history of war. But there are forms of neutrality which I think can be strategic at given moments, which it's that you don't necessarily want to make them essential, you don't want to hold them permanently. But in a given moment, neutrality can also be a weapon of the weak, as well as consensus of the powerful. And keeping that in mind, I think, can be useful when dealing with tricky political problems related to health at tense moments of negotiation. So there might be moments where you'd want to play the I'm just a doctor, even while at the same time really aiming towards, could you please follow these simple guidelines and make everyone a little healthier and safer?
And it maybe helps me understand Dr. Anthony Fauci a little bit. I've heard him do both in the last 2 years, and under the last presidency, he often did frame himself, and this is not open warfare, but I think it's fair to say the United States always lives on the edge of small scale, and there's plenty of small terrorist acts going on day by day in the United States, and plenty of violence. But yeah, he sort of has gone back and forth, and he's been much more aggressive since Biden's been elected, and saying what he thinks, and going up to Congress and lecturing Rand Paul and things like that. And I don't want to draw a parallel if it's not apt, but at the same time, I think about early days of the pandemic, Italy, Spain, health system overrun. United States, pick your state, as you said earlier on. I mean, I just heard in the news today, Idaho is now in medical. They have a special statewide declaration, which basically means they're in triage. Don't expect to go to the hospital and be treated unless you're more grievously injured than the person sitting next to you. ICU beds in parking lots and hallways. I mean, do we need Doctors Without Borders in the U.S.? And I ask that not as a flip question, but because I also wonder what the sort of psychology is of that, and what the potential policy outcome of that is. A sort of recognition that we've tipped over into a set of situations that we can no longer call normal, and we can no longer call under control. And so it requires some humanitarian, what we might call humanitarian intervention. Maybe people never thought you'd need that in Iowa or Nebraska or Idaho or New Jersey or Texas, but pick your state, and in the last 18 months, it's looked like that.
Certainly, and you could say there are versions of that. I mean, you have traveling healthcare professionals who have moved. You may remember in New York City early on, there was in the dark days in New York, there were a whole set of people who arrived, both volunteers and people who were contracted to work in New York, some of whom did all kinds of wonderful things, other of whom arrived, at a moment where they didn't have that much to do. And there were different stories that came out. And so we could see certain kinds of parallels along those lines. I think the one thing I would keep in mind, or two things I would keep in mind with that parallel, are that many people in organizations like Doctors Without Borders have a conceit. They at least like to say that the world should not need them. That if the world was operating properly, they would be redundant. And certainly one could make that case, and it was made, say, during the Ebola outbreak, that why would it fall to non-governmental organizations to do this work? Why are there not formal political organizations to do this work? And many of the people who work for Doctors Without Borders have a belief in there being a stronger healthcare system. And a lot of, part of the background history of Ebola and the background history of COVID, though, again, it's also shown up healthcare systems which are relatively stronger as well as ones that are weaker. So I'm putting the footnote before the statement. But it's exposed inadequacy across healthcare systems around the world, and many efforts to save money or become more efficient, run things in a more business-oriented fashion, classic neoliberal policy, have also resulted in fewer resources when you find out that you need them. And you suddenly find out the extraordinary thing, I think, for any historian of technology also in this country, to suddenly find out there is no manufacturing capability in the United States for personal protective equipment, PPE, which is a term I learned about through Doctors Without Borders, but suddenly entered everyday conversation. And suddenly realizing that all of these things that we depend on in middle-class suburban life in the United States are quite fragile and open to disruption, which leads to your terrain, of course, of disasters and disaster research, which I believe is going to be a growth market in coming decades, sadly. But there's going to be no shortage of things for you to discuss in coming years. And it just exposes again and again the short-sightedness of some of our conceptions of value and how to evaluate the functioning of different systems. And so, yes, certainly, Idaho could use a contingent, probably. They could also use more ICU beds. But unless someone is willing to put them in place and pay for them, and maybe figure out why is healthcare so ludicrously expensive in the United States? It's expensive everywhere, but why is it so exceptionally expensive when you look comparatively? It's costs so much more in the United States than in any other country. All of those kinds of questions, I think, come out in these moments of crisis. They get revealed. And of course, the difficult task then is to take that insight and actually do something with it as the crisis recedes, is the moment when it's no longer acute. That's the real political challenge, is to do things on ordinary days and just not only on exceptional days.
I worry about loss of memory a lot at this time, that if there's not photographs taken, if there's not good stories written, and government doing its job and actually writing what went poorly so that the hospital became a place where you have to do triage. A photograph of an ICU that's now spilled out into a parking lot, that's a powerful image, but I worry that those things are going to go in the memory hole in the United States, because that's not something that there's no hospital director or insurance company or politician in America, Democrats included, who have much incentive to show that the system is as broken as it is.
Absolutely not. Or that, you have county hospitals serving as points of care through emergency rooms, which has long been a complicated, difficult history of workarounds for people who are uninsured in the United States. I would add one footnote that I think is potentially of interest to you and maybe your audience, but certainly to you as a historian, to be thinking about with this term triage, is that it comes from a French verb for sorting, for selecting, and it comes historically from military medicine, And the formal and first form of triage and the military form of triage and disaster form of triage is what we're discussing here, which includes the possibility that if you have people you cannot help anymore, you don't have the supplies to help them, and you think their odds of making it aren't very good, you just palliate them and you try and make them as comfortable as you possibly can, and you leave them to their fate because you need to pay attention to those you can save. It's a focus on saving who's salvageable. And that's very painful and very difficult for most of our ethical sensibilities and philosophical positions. But the triage is also a very common, ordinary practice in most medical systems, like hospitals in the United States, which also means sorting, but it just means who's going to be seen first. Hospital forms of triage. That's what we're accustomed to. And so you might have to wait a long time if you're in the ER and you're not bleeding out, and you look like you can sit there for 12 hours without expiring. They might leave you there for 12 hours while they deal with other people who have bigger problems. But you expect to be seen eventually. And the notion that we might be in a place where some people will not be seen at all, that is the whole also fear of death panels and everything else that has been running through the American debates about healthcare. But the reality is all systems have to select, and it's not an individual choice. And especially if you're ever unconscious, you're not going to be in control of your
Right.
destiny, which is the great blindness of people who imagine health to be a personal affair and a choice solely. Because there'll be many moments in life, early in life and late in life, and then in difficult moments, emergency moments in life, where you may have no choice at all. Someone else has to be choosing for you.
Talking to Peter Redfield on COVID calls today, and I want to come to an article that you wrote, again, in what we might call the early pandemic or the early American stage of the pandemic. You wrote a piece in Cultural Anthropology titled "The Danger of a Single Threat." And I want to read a sentence from this and get you to talk a little bit about this, because it raises some problems that have been on my mind, but I hadn't thought of them quite as clearly as this. You wrote, "There are always many things that can kill you. People will continue to die from multiple causes during a pandemic, both quickly and slowly. Years of tracking medical humanitarianism impressed on me one humbling, simple realization: healthcare is never a singular proposition." So that comes back. You were sounding some of these notes earlier of the problem maybe you discovered in your research on Doctors Without Borders. There's the pandemic, which brings the film crew, but then there's also dengue fever and everything else that's going on, normal disaster. I worry about that a lot with COVID, and we have some ways of visualizing it. I think we don't have the numbers we need to tell the story, but like so-called elective procedures, which have been pushed aside. Some of those are more elective than others. I mean, people who need knee and hip replacements, for example, and now are incapacitated because they can't get into the hospital. Just one example. So why did you have this concern in mind, and say a little bit more about the piece, because the danger, because there's something a little counterintuitive, which is to say, well, we have this monster in front of us, COVID, but you're saying yes, but look behind and around him too.
Exactly. No, that sums it up, that if you're so focused on the monster in front of you, you may miss the other ones who are coming from behind, right? I mean, in any good setup, and I'm not a big fan of horror films, but that's precisely the way you set things up. You set people up to be vulnerable, is they're very focused on a particular direction, and then at an oblique angle, something else will get them, and that's what thrills us as an audience. And I think that applies more generally. Even if you have a debilitating health condition, it may not be the thing that ultimately causes you the most harm. It may be the biggest concern facing you, but it should not lead you to forget that there are many other things. There are many, many other contagious diseases. There are many pathogens, and there are many beneficial microbes also, I should say, we think. I mean, we live in a world where we're starting to explore biologically speaking, we're starting to explore the microbiome, and we're trying to think about not just sanitation in a 19th century sense of total sterilization, but also what kinds of balances do we live with in terms of our environment, our immediate vicinity, our milieu, the people we inhabit with, space with. How do we coexist in this world? And so I was struck during the pandemic precisely by the focus on cleanliness, which is not a bad idea in any. I mean, definitely sterilization is probably a good thing in many contexts. But it's not. It's like carpet bombing, you know. I mean, the way that if you sanitize utterly, you're getting rid of everything. You have no idea what you're really doing. And the history of carpet bombing shows that it's not a very good tool strategically for most military exercises, most military operations. So, keeping that in mind, that with the pandemic, healthcare is about all kinds of things, and any doctor who has a career and treats patients at some point has to come to grips with the fact that ultimately all those patients are going to die, even if you're the best doctor ever, just as all of us will. I mean, not to leave you with a grim note, but it is all of us who are adults. At some point, we come to this realization that if there is any immortal part of us, it won't simply be this physical form. It will be something else that we have a stake in. This physical form is mortal, and if we don't believe in other forms of mortality or believe in reincarnation or whatever else, it will be a different world that we would occupy. And recognizing that medically, I think, is important, especially at those moments of crisis and disaster, because, as you say, the cameras are on something. And it's easy for a good photogenic crisis, it's easy to get attention. For something that's short, quick, and immediate, people will respond, and they'll respond very generously frequently. That's also what most of the evidence shows. Short-term, people will be incredibly caring and giving, many of them, to their neighbors. Longer term, it can be a problem. And as well, for everything that might be slower, everything that might be chronic, might be ongoing, it's very hard to get attention for that and to recognize those kinds of disasters too. Forms of slower violence as opposed to fast violence, to use Rob Nixon's term for it, or structural violence, various ways of talking about things which are deeper and slower as opposed to immediate and acute.
Well, let me follow up on that, because it's something I'm really interested in too, that and this has been a time in which there have been many opportunities, and I think many skilled health communicators have used this opportunity, as they should, to show just what we were just talking about. Okay, well, the healthcare system is actually underserved. We should have more beds in a rural health setting, for example. Or COVID demonstrates, even in very wealthy countries, the vast amount of chronic illness that's out there, so-called underlying conditions. And you may note, just a little note, I've been going back and rereading all of the obituaries that I read on COVID calls. And in the early days, first couple of months, whether or not somebody had an underlying condition was often emphasized. And I think that was a sort of I'm in a parenthetical here, but I think it's an interesting one, at least to me, that there was still this moment of coping at that time to say that if you're a really healthy person, you still don't need to worry about COVID because you had to have an underlying condition to be vulnerable to it. I see that kind of disappearing by the summer of last year. But I think the larger point is, what are the structures that are out there that keep us from being able to focus on more than one of these threats at the same time? You talked about the photogenic nature of disaster. So part of it may be a media culture that has to tell a story, and it's hard to tell a complicated story. You can tell one if you have an hour, but you can't tell one if you have 40 seconds. Maybe it's the way the health system itself is structured, or the emergency management system is structured, which is often very military. It's dealing with the problem in front of you. You deal with that problem, and then you deal with the next. It's not good at fighting multiple battles simultaneously. Or maybe there's, I've wondered about this too. I mean, there's sort of social psychology of risk and disaster. Some people have said, well, this is an advantage for humans. Evolutionarily, it's advantageous for us to focus on one thing and then forget about bad things that happen. It keeps us, always ready to run from the bear. As a historian, I'm often a little uncomfortable with psychosocial kind of explanations of human behavior because they move us into a context-free space. You don't have to choose from that list of multiple choice, Peter, but I'm curious what you, again, like this is a problem of singular focus. There should be a way out of it.
Well, first I would say my answer would probably be all of the above. I mean, I think it would be a situation where we would need at least another hour to begin to scratch the surface of all the different factors at play. There's also the fact that people become accustomed to many different kinds of situations, and I think that people get tired of a given story, and especially if you live in a media culture which are used to very fast changing entertainment, it can be harder to have the same thing playing in regular life constantly. So all of the above, absolutely. I would say at a way out, I think part of it is one thing that would be counterintuitive is accepting that safety can never be 100%. There's no guarantee of security, and security as a concept is inflationary, and so is health. And both of them, you can never have too much of it, and yet it will never be enough in the end, because in the end, as just noted, sadly, we expect, like all our ancestors, to pass beyond this world. And so it's this life. And so there's a kind of illusion built into both the pursuit of health and the pursuit of security. And disasters are those moments where you realize vulnerability. And I think most of our ancestors from many different cultural traditions, all cultural traditions, dealt with what we now might term risk. They were aware of the fact that the world could have unexpected things. And there's a lot of storytelling and a lot of mythology that constantly reminds us of that. And there may be other forces that have greater control than, any sense that we can exert control over our lives completely is inevitably shown to be an illusion. And that's a hard truth, I think, to grapple with, and yet ultimately a very important one.
So as an anthropologist and an ethnographer, you've done all kinds of very complicated ethnographic projects. I wonder, is ethnography in crisis somehow different? And I think about this in two ways. One is those like yourself who are specialized in thinking about the kinds of things we've just been talking about and finding the stories and the structures and the cultural systems that you need to tap into, the people you need to get to trust you so that you can really get them to open up about everything we've just been talking about. But I've also been thinking about all of the many people who study culture whose lives have been disrupted by the pandemic, who've now had to adapt their ethnographic practice to distance or to the reality that maybe they wanted to study one thing about culture in a place, but now everything is about, again, what we were just talking about. It's about COVID or about the package of health insecurity that comes with COVID. So I guess I don't want you to give up all your trade secrets, but at the same time, like ethnography at this time may be evolving or it's in a particular moment. I wonder sort of methodologically what you think that might be about.
I think it's absolutely evolving, and it has been for some time because, there are different versions of ethnography and different histories of ethnography that one can tell. But to give you a short, simple story, it's developed for village life, essentially, methodologically. So it's a face-to-face, small-scale society where you can go be somewhere and talk to people and get a sense of what is going on by virtue of doing that. And anthropologists have been following problems, especially people who studied things like science, technology, disasters, healthcare, and things which were transnational that didn't quite fit that village form. And people have been working online for quite some time. So there are various forms of ethnography that can grapple with an absence of presence or work at a distance and so on. It's a different kind of exercise. It's not the same, but it's nonetheless a methodological approach. The one thing I would say in terms of crisis, emergency, the concepts I was trying to think about, especially in relation to humanitarianism and disasters more generally, is I actually think this is a place where the methods of an ethnographer and the methods of a historian might converge at times. Because if you're looking at a phenomenon which is very presentist and very focused on a concentrated moment, from my perspective, one of the most revealing approaches is to expand the time frame around it and look what happened before and what happened afterward. So you begin to see that there might be a prehistory to this particular episode of whatever it is, a catastrophic flood or an outbreak disease or a war, and you realize that it didn't just descend from the sky, in a single day. It came from somewhere. And then after the cameras leave, there's usually another story that goes on. And there's a lot of very good work that's been done, say, in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti, showing the longer trajectory of what a disaster looks like, especially in a setting which has been a long, painful, political, colonial site of suffering and resilience and rebuilding and experiences of a variety of different kinds of forms of disaster over time. So Haiti is a very particular context, and it's also a setting which is full of aid organizations and so on. But there's been a lot of good work there. And then other parts of the world, people have been doing this as well. And that's part for me why I ended up deciding I would think about try and work on Doctors Without Borders more slowly, partly as a justification that I'm just a slow guy. And so, I don't do things quickly. But that it, at the same time, the justification part of it, the rationale, was that can actually be revealing. When you go back and when you look at something years on, it can tell you something about what happened that commentary at a moment might not. And for this pandemic, I think it's probably also true. There will be later things that may emerge and come out that will augment and alter our understanding of the experiences we might be having right now.
We're almost up on time in my discussion with Peter Redfield here today. And Peter, actually, I'd like to just close out by asking you what you're working on next. I don't know if you have a book-length project that's sort of in the making, or you've been also writing a lot of essays in this time, in pandemic time. So what should we be looking for from you in the coming year or years?
Well, I've been working on another project that I imagined would be a quicker one, but has turned into a slower one as well. I've been writing bits and pieces of it in essays, but I hope it will also be eventually a short book looking at little devices. That is, certain kinds of small inventions that people are creating, innovations to try and intervene in what were once called social problems, that is, large problems of, say, healthcare or basic human needs, breakdown of infrastructure, having clean drinking water, how to have electricity if you don't have any power center nearby or you don't have a stable grid, how you create devices that can function in off-grid settings, in disaster settings. And I'm interested in this partly because some of them are interesting stories in and of themselves, and they're kind of fascinating. They reflect a kind of human ingenuity, but also because they, I think, reveal a lot about our imagination of what are problems, what are solutions, what are the ways in which we might frame a problem, and the scale with which we imagine the future, especially when people are less optimistic about the future than they might have been earlier in the 20th century in episodes of building big infrastructure, big, large technical systems, massive interventions. And so that's what I've been tracking and hope to have more to say about in coming years.
That sounds fantastic, and I think it will also, this COVID time, getting the history. I'm sure people are collecting this, the history of what's happened inside healthcare settings to deal with absence or breakdown of machines, and the coping skills and the ingenuity of essential workers in those moments has been pretty staggering. I imagine that some of it quite nauseating. I think in some ways the improvisation of PPE. So if you're seeing a nurse wearing a garbage bag, you might think, what have we come to? But on the other hand, that's a safety device made in the moment to save the essential worker's life. I don't know if that kind of improvisation is in your mind when you think about this project, but it's been in my mind with COVID.
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of how I first got launched on this project, was because in the world of Doctors Without Borders and similar organizations, there is a lot of improvisation. Improvisation is necessary in order to get systems to function frequently, even at the same time that they've created systems and kits and a whole mode of dealing with uncertainty in terms of little devices and packaging, and not all of them are little, but creating a modular system of response. And so I became interested in this. And yes, the pandemic has been a gold mine for this stuff, especially the early pandemic. But I think the larger stories and the reminder, I mean, it's like climate change and all the rest of the shadows currently haunting our present. There's a moment of realization that we live in an era where we may have to do a lot of improvising again. And that's disruptive to people who've been used to sort of steady state modernist norms of living in buildings like the one where I imagine we both are currently, where all systems are humming in the background, just working, and we don't pay any attention to them until they break down.
Just a reminder, you've been listening to COVID Calls, and tomorrow I have two COVID Calls episodes back to back at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Please catch my discussion about disaster memorials in East Asia with Alex Jania and Christina Burnham. And then at 7:30 p.m., please catch a return conversation with two teachers, Angela Miner and Rebecca Martinson, and I will have co-host Shivani Patel. And this is coming back to a conversation we had 1 year ago. So this is a back to school conversation on COVID Calls with two teachers who'll tell us about what the last year has been like for them. So please do join me tomorrow at 6 and 7:30 p.m. for COVID Calls. And I just want to thank Peter Redfield. Been looking forward to this conversation for months, Peter, and I had to reschedule it too. And thank you for accommodating that. And it's great to be with you, my friend.
And likewise, and thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed this immensely, and thanks for doing this series, which sounds absolutely wonderful. So I will be tuning in the future.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow, 6 p.m.